Hey folks, welcome to our Prep Test 123 explanation series. In this series, I talk with Madeline Jessen, another LSAT professional, about every LSAT question in Prep Test 23. We go very in depth to explain them, and hopefully you can see how through our thought process, the LSAT does make perfect sense. This is a very learnable test, and you can learn to crush it. So without further ado, let's get off to the questions. Economist. Every business strives to increase its productivity. For this increases profits for the owners and the likelihood that the business will survive.
Okay, so it seems like here the economist is just sharing with us a just general business principle of, a goal that businesses have. Seems to just be a kind of generalization of fact here. Um, so we'll see where it
Yeah.
keeps going.
And intuitively, this one makes sense. Like they're saying companies try to make money. Well, they don't quite say money, they say productivity, but I'm connecting that to if you're more productive, you get more output for your inputs, whether that's labor or money invested. You make more
Hmm.
money, that increases profits. What business does not want to make profits because otherwise they die and go out of business?
Yeah.
So far, no real conclusion they've drawn. Just seems like a fact about the world. So maybe they're going to say there are, well, I guess we can't say there's exceptions. I was thinking there might be, but they say every business. But maybe they say this is good, this is bad, make some judgment about like capitalism or some, I don't know, they can go in a million directions. So let's see. They continue. But not all efforts to increase productivity are beneficial to the business as a whole.
Okay, so right away, the economist here is seemingly making this claim because my reaction is, how do we know this? Why are not all efforts to increase productivity beneficial? Says who, right? What is the evidence for that? So, continuing with the argument, I am hoping that I would want, I suppose, the economist to explain this, but it may, depending on the context, it may just be something that we accept and goes on to make a different claim. But as is, I feel like this is not an explained statement. They're saying it's
Yeah.
beneficial, but how do we know?
And perhaps we give an example, which because it intuitively makes sense. Like you could have some business practice that backfires. Maybe you try to make all your employees work 20 hours a day so that you don't have to hire as many, or you can like get the most out of them, but then they all quit because no one wants to work these terrible hours. So it's pretty easy to, I'd say, conceptualize a situation,
Yeah.
but also they have to like, I'd want an example because on the LSAT, we're not on the side of this argument. We're not trying to help them out. We're trying to like dunk on them, which Madeline was doing a good job of and saying like, okay, you've made this conclusion, which I mean, it's likely the conclusion. We don't know for sure yet, but it does seem that way, which is that these attempts to make more productivity can backfire, but they provided literally zero evidence thus far. So I'm skeptical, at least thus far. And they finish up by saying, often attempts to increase productivity decrease the number of employees, which clearly harms the dismissed employees as well as the sense of security of the retained employees.
Okay, so here we have an example of how an effort to increase productivity is not beneficial. It's actually pretty similar, Ben, to what you said. Not quite the same example, but you said, like, what if they do a ton of hours? Here, it's what if we just cut back the number of employees? They say this decreases morale or the sense of security. They don't say morale, but it's harmful for the employees, which, I guess from a business standpoint, perhaps that's not the concern of the business. But if, the remaining employees feel insecure, then that perhaps is not great to the overall business. When going back to that claim about the business as a whole, here's an entity of the business that is harmed. So it does
Yeah,
seem
the
like that was the conclusion after all.
Yeah, I was having the same thoughts, which is like, okay, the employees are upset, but who cares? We're talking about the business, not the employees like mental health. I guess if we were talking about them, and you could make the argument that like maybe having upset employees could lead to diminished productivity, but also maybe it doesn't, in which case we're saying it's bad for the business. And our evidence for that is that it's bad for the employees, which is not the same thing. This is one of the most common LSAT issues where our evidence and our conclusion are talking about different things. And
Mm-hmm.
reasonably, I'd say an unskeptical reader might just see employees business. That's the same thing. Who cares? But it's not though. And so if I was going to attack this argument, I would say, well, I don't care about the mental health of my employees. I'm some evil, greedy businessman. I just care if they're making the widgets and whether or not they're happy doesn't affect me. So
Yeah. You could argue that maybe if the it could, but it goes both ways. You could argue if that the employees that remain have a low sense of security, that, they might not be motivated to produce their best work or be more productive, or conversely, maybe they're feeling pressure and work extra hard, and it could be good for the business actually. But you're exactly right, we don't know.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I think this is a good point, which is on the LSAT, you really are a mercenary. Like we don't have a side. What we
Yeah.
know is that this argument, it could be better, it could also be worse. And so whatever they ask us, we're ready to either make it better, make it worse. Maybe they'll just ask us something really obvious, like they happen to do on this question. But it doesn't matter what they ask us. Like we fully digested it. We know the argument is about companies trying to increase productivity, but it backfires. We are unsold, but we are open to being convinced. So we're ready for whatever they throw at us. And here they ask us, which of the following most accurately expresses the main conclusion of the economist's argument?
All right. So all this is asking us is basically word for word what it says. We want to be really, really specific with what is the economist's claim. And when I attack a question like this, I like to get very surgical with it. Like we are going right to the text. What can we tangibly, concretely identify as being that conclusion? And that is going to be our prediction for our correct answer. Typically, in a question like this, they are not super creative. They tend to just regurgitate pretty close to what the conclusion in our argument is saying. Sometimes they'll get a bit creative with paraphrasing. With question one, though, I don't suspect them to be particularly creative here. And so, as Ben and I said, we would say that the claim is that not all efforts to increase productivity are beneficial to the business as a whole. That was the they give a reason for that. It's a statement that the author gives evidence to support. And at this point, personally, when I realize that, okay, this is a main conclusion question, I personally kind of back off a little bit at this point with being super critical of the claim or whatever. At this point, I don't really care. We're just, look, what's our conclusion, answer choice, and move on.
Yeah.
I die on
Yeah,
the
it's a
hill
good
anymore
point.
of like if it's good or bad.
Yeah, because once we know it's a conclusion, our whole job is just what was their point. The good
Yeah,
thing is by attacking it critically, we know what their point was, which is that
exactly.
not all these efforts actually have the intended effect. Whether or not that's proven, we still had our doubts, but our doubts are now flushed. Like we don't care. It's just what was their point? And it's that, hey, sometimes we try to increase productivity and it backfires. It's very worth making that prediction, really, regardless of question type, because what it does is it'll make many of these answers just totally off.
Mm-hmm.
So starting with A, they say if, and I personally am already pausing just after that first word. Like, Madeline, what do you think? Would you continue to read A, or how
I
far?
mean, no, because it's a conditional statement. It's hypothetical, right? It's this, new information that we don't have in our argument. If our conclusion was also a conditional statement, if the claim said if blah blah blah, or some variation of that, then yeah, I would keep reading. But right away, we know that our conclusion is very concrete. Not all efforts to increase productivity are beneficial to the business as a whole. That's it.
Yeah, worth noting, like we spent a lot of time thinking about the argument, and we're spending substantially less time on these answers. Like it's just one of those things where if it's not lining up with what we know the answer is, we can get rid of it. So by knowing that our conclusion was not all these efforts work to increase, or not all efforts to increase productivity actually help the business, then they're saying like, oh, if an action taken. I'm like, well, we weren't talking hypotheticals here. We were talking about in the real world, they actually have this impact, which is that they do not always work. So you can be very nitpicky in terms of how you get rid of wrong answers. And I think that's enough to at least conclusively get rid of A, at least on a first pass, because our initial presumption is that these answers are wrong. We're looking for things to be incorrect about them. We should be surprised when something looks valid.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, moving on to B. Some measures taken by a business to increase productivity fail to be beneficial to the business as a whole.
This looks pretty on the money. If we again go back to our claim, not all efforts to increase productivity are beneficial. Not all are is essentially the same thing as saying some are not. So pretty similar, paraphrased slightly. I think this is a good contender.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they say measures as opposed to effort, some as opposed to not all. These are different words, but it's not about the word. It's about the underlying meaning. And the
Yeah.
meaning is that they're trying to increase productivity, it's backfiring. And in that sense, B lines up perfectly. And if the whole sum does not equal not all and measures equals efforts is like, whoa, that's crazy. I don't mean to be that guy, but this may not be the field for you. Like these are not giant assumptions to jump over. It is just like the meaning of the words, and you gotta get to the point where it's not about just matching words, it's about matching
Hmm.
ideas.
Yeah, I always tell people we never want to we want to be really, really careful about making a judgment solely on like the presence or absence of a certain word, depending on the context. Obviously, for example, A is different because, if that does signal a difference in meaning of what we want, right? So in that case, it's appropriate. But I, see students all the time will say, oh, that answer choice says most. So it's wrong. I'm like, okay, but what is the rest of the answer saying? And what are your facts saying or your argument saying? Because if we're just missing the context here, then you're dying on the wrong hill.
Yeah, it's a broader good point about the LSAT world, which is there's a lot of things that people hyper focus on, and certain
Mhm.
are it's like for example, we didn't talk about indicator words when we were talking through this argument. There are technically words that tend to indicate conclusions, but I guarantee you that LSAC writes questions that are testing those people. They love to write therefore and then introduce a premise. We're going to talk about this at a later date, but it really has to come back to the underlying ideas. If you're doing it via the words, short term, yes, it's like quote unquote easier to do. Long term, I promise you, you are selling yourself short and you're making this much more difficult than it has to be. So moving on to C, they say only if. So already, I imagine we're pausing.
Yeah, because it's going to bring a new kind of specific condition here, which is likely going to be new information. We don't know what it says, but highly, highly likely
Yeah,
they're going to
I mean,
specify
we
something
can read
that's
on
not
for the
discussed.
sake of.
Yeah.
So it's only if indicates a necessary condition, and they then say the employees of a business are also its owners. I'm like, were we talking about like worker co-ops where like the
Yeah.
coffee shop where like the barista is also the owner? Like this is new information. We were not like what? So I mean I'm done at that point. I'm often not even reading the whole answers. I'm just like that is enough to sufficiently get rid of it. There's
Yeah. As
no
soon as
way.
it's not working, there's no coming back from that.
Yeah, like we're not on the side of these answers. You guys do not need to help them out. You're looking to get rid of them. 80% of them are wrong. So that should be your default presumption. And you should be surprised when you're like, oh, that actually kind of does answer the question. Most of them are going to be incorrect. Already, D, there is no business that does not make efforts to increase its productivity.
They do say this. They say every business strives to increase productivity. So this is something that is stated in the argument, but it's not the conclusion of the argument. Again, we've identified the conclusion as that statement that not all efforts are beneficial to the business as a whole. So even though D is true, it's just a premise. It's not our conclusion. So it's not going to be correct.
Yeah, exactly. And the way we know it's the conclusion, or sorry, that it's a premise supporting our conclusion, is that this was the evidence for our other claim. Like, this is just a fact about the world. Businesses are trying to make money or productivity, I guess. I'm equating that with money in my head. But that's not the point. The point is, but some of them fail to do so. And that's what we care about. And here's the thing, you don't need any fancy tricks should you read critically. The conclusions become obvious. There are conclusion tricks that we will be getting into at a later date. However, the big thing is just, is it support or is it being supported? That is kind of the universal for what is the point. And
Yeah, and I always say that like any sort of tricks are kind of like at best tools in a toolbox. Like you said, it becomes problematic if we're over reliant on them and not actually thinking like critically about what is our argument trying to say, what is supported.
yeah, well, and E seems quite similar to this, what we just talked about. Here we say decreasing the number of employees in a business undermines the sense of security of retained employees.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why these efforts are not beneficial to business as a whole. It's supporting information, so it's not our conclusion.
Yeah, so E is just the example we gave, supporting, like Madeline said, our point. But so technically, yes, we did say that. Also, that is not our point. That is the evidence for it. So yeah, at this point, I feel like we've conclusively eliminated A, C, D, and E. B is the only one left standing. I see no issues with B. So I feel pretty good about picking that. Hey folks, hopefully that question made perfect sense. If it did, and you like the way that we do LSAT, I would check out our free course at heyfuturelawyer.com. I will link it in the bio. Once again, that is heyfuturelawyer.com. Our full comprehensive course is free. All you need to do is sign up for a free account and you can access all 7 hours of the course with actual LSAT questions in it, just like this question. You can also access a free class that we host once a month so that you can come hang out and talk to us.